Hello, this is Max. A transfer student dealing with grief and adjusting to a new environment becomes involved with a group that has a reputation for its perfect public image. However, he soon discovers that this image is just a mask hiding something dark. Don't forget to subscribe. Late one evening in Cradle Bay, two high school students, Andy and Mary Jo, share an intimate moment in a car. Andy stops Mary Jo from going further, citing a need to maintain his fluids. Despite this, Mary Jo insists on pushing the boundaries. Suddenly, Andy's eyes turn red, and he fatally injures Mary Jo. Officers Cox and Kramer approach the vehicle due to curfew violations. Cox calls Andy out of the car, and Kramer discovers Mary Jo's lifeless body. Andy seizes the officer's gun and shoots him, all while insisting on needing his fluids. Cox manages to disarm Andy calmly and instructs him to leave. Andy removes Mary Jo's body from the car and drives away, while Cox reports the incident to someone. Unbeknownst to them, another student named Gavin has been observing the scene from a distance and quickly flees. The next day, a ferry arrives at Cradle Bay, and Steve, a new student, reflects silently. His sister, Lindsay, expresses her excitement about starting anew and reassures her brother that things will be okay. The family moves in, and Mr. Clark, Steve's father, briefly checks on his son before leaving. Steve places photos of himself and his brother, Alan, on a surface and has a painful dream about Alan that night. The following day, Steve starts his first day at school, and the teacher praises Trent for interpreting a literary piece while singling out Steve for coming from Chicago. Before Steve can respond, Dickie interrupts the class, leading to a confrontation between classmates. The others quickly intervene and separate the two students, and the teacher sends Dickie straight to the principal's office. Steve looks around the classroom and notices that only one person, Gavin, reacts differently. Gavin signals Steve to stay quiet. During lunch, while Steve eats alone, Gavin and his friend UV join him at the table. Lorna, another student, passes by and Gavin greets her with obvious admiration, but she ignores him. Steve asks Gavin why he won't approach her more seriously, and Gavin explains the social hierarchy in their high school, with the Blue Ribbons being the elite group of model students. Gavin proudly mentions that he and UV belong to a different category, which intrigues Steve. That evening, Shannon, Lindsay's friend, has dinner with the Clarks. Shannon comments on Alan's spelling abilities, which confuses her since she's only familiar with Steve. Lindsay clarifies that Alan is a brother who passed away, but Mr. Clark abruptly shuts down the conversation. Steve frustratedly questions why they can't talk about their deceased brother, but his father dismisses him. Steve sarcastically comments on the situation and walks away. Meanwhile, Dickie goes to a car shop for some parts but is greeted by the Blue Ribbons instead. They surround him while holding poles and bats, and Dickie tries to avoid feeling intimidated, but he's vastly outnumbered. The next day, Principal Weathers calls Steve to meet with Dr. Caldecott, an outstanding counselor. They try to convince Steve to join the Blue Ribbons, pointing out his tragic loss and how the group can help him cope and be productive. Steve responds indifferently despite flashes of memories of Alan. Dr. Caldecott advises him to make some friends, and Steve promptly leaves. As he heads out, he spots a beautiful and free-spirited student. Gavin appears and introduces him to Rachel, a close friend. Gavin teases the two, sensing chemistry between them, which Rachel dismisses. However, Gavin insists on them hanging out together, and everyone agrees. As night falls, Gavin attempts to persuade adults to buy him some alcohol, but he's unsuccessful. Suddenly, Chug, a member of the Blue Ribbons, approaches Rachel and invites her to the yogurt shop his group frequents. Gavin makes sarcastic remarks about Chug's attempts to hit on Rachel, and Chug eventually leaves. Afterward, Chug waits in line at the grocery store to pay for his items. He looks out and sees Rachel by her truck, and his vision begins to flash yellow with an X mark appearing periodically. His expression becomes more aggressive, and his eyes start to glow red. A random customer accidentally bumps into him, leading to a fierce attack on the stranger and the stranger's friend. Officer Cox tries to calm him down but fails, and Chug charges towards his perceived enemies like an enraged bull. Eventually, he loses strength and collapses on the floor, asking the officer about his milkshake. Observing this disturbing scene, Steve turns to his new friends and inquires about Chug's behavior. Rachel explains that it's common among the Blue Ribbons, speculating that they might be using steroids. However, Gavin insists that it's something more sinister. Rachel dismisses Gavin's theory, which frustrates him, prompting him to walk away. The next day, Gavin takes Steve to the secret smoking spot at the school and shares what he witnessed on the night when Eddie took Mary Jo's and Officer Kramer's lives. Suddenly, the janitor, Mr. Newberry, emerges from a manhole while holding a rat and scolds the teenagers for intruding on his territory. Gavin introduces Steve to Mr. Newberry, who talks about his eradicator, a device similar to a radio that emits a sound to scare rats. He complains that it doesn't work and then charges at some rats like a madman. Later, everyone gathers to watch the Blue Ribbons, including the new member, Dickie, destroy his own Mustang. Gavin insists that they turn Dickie into a robot, a notion that UV agrees with. Steve, on the other hand, firmly disbelieves their claims and advises them to smoke less. That evening, Steve visits the yogurt shop, where he gets invited to join the Blue Ribbons at their table. They encourage him to become friends with them, but their conversation is interrupted by Gavin, who tries to pull Steve away from the group by picking a fight with them. To avoid a brawl, Steve escorts Gavin out. Once outside, Gavin reiterates his theory that the Blue Ribbons are all hypnotized and shows a photo of his former friends who are now members of the group. Steve argues that they might have simply chosen a different lifestyle, but Gavin is determined and leads him somewhere. They sneak into the school to observe a meeting of the Blue Ribbons' parents. One concerned mother voices her worries about her child's unkind behavior towards others outside the group. Dr. Caldecott reassures her that it's typical for high-achieving kids to exhibit a sense of superiority. Then, Colleen, Caldecott's assistant, discusses the issues faced by the new Blue Ribbons member. Steve comments on how unimpressive the person is, but when the parents of the new member arrive, Gavin panics upon seeing his own parents and hastily leaves, with Steve following him. Gavin expresses his frustration and hopelessness about being sold by his parents. Steve invites him to lay low at his house that night, but Gavin reveals a gun, determined to fight. Steve gets into a physical struggle with him to disarm him and instructs Gavin to go home. Gavin asks for the gun back, but Steve refuses and walks away. The following day in the school cafeteria, Steve, UV, and Rachel are shocked to see Gavin behaving overly neat, resembling the Blue Ribbons. Rachel tries to approach him, but the elite group prevents her from interfering. Steve attempts to intervene, but the male members block his way. The cafeteria quickly empties, and Steve is beaten and surrounded. Gavin manages to stop the attack and helps Steve to his feet. However, when Steve asks about his well-being, Gavin suddenly delivers a knee blow and declares that he feels fantastic. Mr. Newberry watches as Steve storms away, ignoring Rachel, and UV kicks over the janitor's bucket, mocks his mental capacity, and laughs. Afterward, Steve sees the Blue Ribbons in the yogurt shop, with Gavin fitting seamlessly among them. Steve then heads to the smoking hideout, where Mr. Newberry starts talking about rats. Steve notices a novel in the janitor's pocket, which surprises him because he previously thought that Mr. Newberry couldn't read. The janitor continues to babble and shout, so Steve decides to leave. As he's about to exit the door, Mr. Newberry's demeanor suddenly changes, leaving Steve confused. Mr. Newberry explains how people's behaviors can change drastically when they pretend to be extremely dim-witted in front of others. When Steve returns home, he notices that the Blue Ribbons are following him. Inside the house, he encounters Lorna, who introduces herself as Lindsay's tutor. Steve becomes increasingly anxious about the bizarre events unfolding around him. Lorna tries to approach him, but Steve ignores her and asks her to leave. Lorna goes to the bathroom, and as she glances at Steve, her vision flashes yellow with the X mark once again. She undoes the buttons of her blouse, advancing toward the man. Steve sternly demands her departure, yet Lorna disregards his words, planting a kiss on him, revealing a crimson glow in her eyes. Concerned, he pushes her away, prompting Lorna to express remorse while rambling about the situation. Unexpectedly, she collides with the mirror, causing her head to impact it. Taking hold of a fragment of the broken mirror, she assaults Steve, who reacts by pushing her, inducing convulsions. Upon regaining consciousness, she adjusts her blouse and exits to another room, citing an impending test. Steve, bewildered and shocked, watches her depart with a bleeding head, seemingly unfazed. Later, Lorna lies unconscious on an operating table in a clinic as a nurse reports the removal of a chip. The doctor, revealed to be Caldecott, expresses disappointment at his subject's violent reactions when aroused, instructing the nurse to dispose of Lorna and inform her parents of mis-cheerleading practices. Caldecott reveals his callousness. Meanwhile, Rachel becomes increasingly wary of Caldecott's actions, investigating Gavin's sudden transformation. In a clandestine smoking area, she discovers a disc bearing her name, only to be interrupted by Chug's unwanted advances, observed by Newberry. Rejecting Chug's advances, Rachel incurs his wrath, leading to a physical altercation interrupted by a rat-triggered eradicator. Taking advantage of the distraction, Rachel escapes as Chug futilely seeks the source of the noise, impressing Newberry with his invention. Steve visits Rachel, who reveals Gavin's message on a disc, detailing Caldicott's sinister plans and his past in psychiatric facilities. Deciding to investigate Bishop Flats, the duo uncovers Caldicott's inhumane experiments. While exploring the facility, they encounter Caldicott's daughter, Betty, among the tormented patients. Attempting to flee, they are apprehended by Officer Cox, only to be rescued by Newberry. Back at Steve's home, Caldicott's unexpected arrival reveals his parents' involvement with the Blue Ribbons, prompting Steve to lash out. As they attempt to flee, they are apprehended by the Blue Ribbons, with Rachel already under their control. Separated from his sister, Steve finds himself restrained in Caldicott's facility, witnessing Rachel's captivity. As Caldicott prepares for a procedure to silence Steve, the teenager defiantly recites Betty's song, provoking the doctor's ire. The hypnotic session begins as Steve continuously hears the doctor's voice from a recording, repeating how he must conform and be excellent. Steve fights the mind control with all his willpower, but the device slowly approaches to place something over his eyes. Seizing the opportunity, Steve uses the hidden scalpel to free his hand from the restraints. Another doctor comes in to check on him, and just in time, Steve manages to stab the approaching doctor and free himself. Steve rushes to find Rachel, and he discovers her in a similar hypnotic state as he was just moments ago. He releases her from her restraints and helps her to her feet. However, Chug intercepts them, and the two face off with Chug initially gaining the upper hand. Rachel intervenes by hitting Chug on the head to save Steve. Chug, now focused on Rachel, approaches her menacingly. Without hesitation, Rachel strikes Chug again, causing him to lose consciousness. Steve and Rachel make their escape from the facility. They encounter UV, who has arrived in a car. UV asks Steve an academic question to confirm that he's back to normal, and once satisfied, they plan to leave. However, before they can get away, the Blue Ribbons block the road, and Dr. Caldicott steps forward. A car honks behind them, and Dr. Caldicott fires at it, but the driver, revealed to be Newberry, skillfully maneuvers the vehicle to hit Dr. Caldicott and his group. The vehicle speeds past them, and the Blue Ribbons give chase, but Newberry reveals a multitude of eradicators hidden in his car's hood. Activating the eradicators, Newberry emits sound waves that cause the approaching Blue Ribbons to convulse and writhe in pain. Mocking them further, Newberry drives away while the hypnotized teenagers continue to suffer the effects of the frequency they're sensitive to. Steve instructs UV to take the girls to the ferry and wait for him there, and he chases Newberry on a motorcycle. He catches up to Newberry, who stops his car. Newberry explains to Steve that they can't allow the hypnotized teenagers to graduate and enter the real world, as it could lead to a tragedy. Steve argues that they need help, but Newberry reveals a bullet wound from Dr. Caldicott's earlier shooting spree, implying that he can't do it alone. As the hypnotized teenagers close in on them, Newberry warns Steve to hurry back to the ferry. He activates the eradicators in his car, causing the teenagers to convulse, and Steve makes his escape. Approaching like a pack of wild animals, the rest of the group climbs Newberry's vehicle, prompting him to drive off the road, causing them to plunge off a cliff. After the tragic incident, Caldicott arrives, with Steve declaring that it is all over. The doctor, however, refutes Steve's assertion, claiming there will always be troubled teens and clueless parents in need of guidance. Their confrontation intensifies as Steve confronts the doctor, who attempts to push the teenager off the cliff. Steve, displaying resilience, manages to evade the attack and gain the upper hand, bringing the face-off to a critical turning point. In a climactic moment, Steve manages to kick Caldicott off the cliff, causing the doctor to plummet to his demise. Following this intense encounter, Steve hastily rides his motorbike to the port just as the last ferry of the day is departing. He accelerates and skillfully leaps across the gap in the bridge, successfully leaving Cradle Bay behind. Steve boards the ferry and is finally reunited with Rachel, who warmly embraces him. Overjoyed, he tells her that they are the only ones left and can make any place their home. Their heartfelt moment is interrupted by the arrival of UV and Lindsay, who playfully interrupt the couple. Years later, in a different high school, a new student teacher is introduced to an unruly class. The teacher, dressed in his finest suit, enters the room as the homeroom advisor departs. The student teacher, named Gavin, confidently faces the class, greeting them with a charming smile and distinctive glowing red eyes, hinting at a continuation of the mysterious events. If you are interested in such films, please proceed to the next video on the screen and also share your thoughts about this film in the comments. Give us a like and subscribe. Goodbye.